Good afternoon, class. I almost felt like saying. Good afternoon and welcome to this. This is actually an ELF, European Liberal Forum event, hosted by, or organized by Fores from Sweden and hosted by Agenda here in Helsinki. My name is Ted. I'm the executive manager of the think tank Agenda. And it is my pleasure to welcome especially our international guests to Helsinki. It's always exciting to see people come over, especially in November, when Helsinki is showing its finest sites, parts. We're talking about sites to see that are indoors, so that is a good idea. We also have two participants online with us, Johan and Olafur, who will join us on the screen after the presentation. Yeah, I think that is on my behalf.
Thank you, Ted.
I'm happy to see you here, and I'm really happy to see so many people here today.
Yeah, so am I. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, so my name is Anna Willman, and I am a climate policy specialist at the Green and Liberal think tank Fores in Sweden, and I will be moderating this seminar. And as some of you may know, the EU has in many ways taken a leadership role in global climate action by setting ambitious targets and implementing landmark policy packages like Fit for 55. But as we look ahead, we at Fores have been asking ourselves, so what's next? And the UN emissions gap report that was released last week once again reminds us of the urgent need to reduce our emissions rapidly and significantly. Yet to become climate neutral and eventually bring global temperature back down, we must also remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Fortunately, methods and technologies exist that could deliver substantial carbon removal. But scaling these methods require massive investments in both markets and infrastructure. And current incentives, even here in Europe, remain insufficient. So that's why I'm very pleased to launch this policy paper today, which proposes several models that we could adopt to help scale these solutions. And you will hear more about that shortly from the authors, followed by some insights from our extinguished panel. But first, I'm very pleased to hand over to Mats Löfström, member of the Finnish Parliament and also board member of the European Liberal Forum. Mats, welcome up.
Thank you so much, Anna. It's a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to address you as a board member of the European Liberal Forum, a political foundation sponsored by the European Parliament and who is also financing this kind of projects and working together with Agenda and Fores. And we are really happy to emphasize what Ted said, to see people coming all the way to Helsinki in November. It's a pleasure to gather today and to hear insights from this report and also to discuss the climate challenges we face and the solutions for a sustainable future. The latest report by the researchers from the Swedish Environmental Research Institute highlights the crucial role of carbon capture in our efforts to reach net zero emissions. Before I was selected to the Finnish Parliament 10 years ago, I worked in the European Parliament, and at that time too, we discussed carbon capture quite a lot, even though the technology wasn't so mature as today and the concrete project hadn't advanced. But I remember lengthy discussions with the honourable member from the United Kingdom, Mr. Chris Davis, who was talking quite a lot about carbon capture already at that time and also for a long time. Technologies such as bioenergy with carbon capture and storage and direct air carbon capture and storage are emphasized as effective methods for reducing and permanently storing carbon dioxide. And we will hear more about that today. And therefore, I will not go into the report more in detail because the experts are sitting here on the front row. I wish you all an insightful day here and with discussion and inspirations where we can explore practical steps to reduce our climate impact. On behalf of the European Liberal Forum, I want to thank you for being here and your crucial commitment to this important topic. Thank you, and looking forward to read the report and read the report again, and not only the highlights and to hear the discussions today.
Super.
So,
thank you, Mats.
Welcome all.
Thank you. And now it's time to hear from the authors of the report. So we have Lars Zetterberg, Senior Researcher at IVL, the Swedish Environmental Research Institute, and Kenneth Möllersten, also a Senior Researcher at IVL.
Thank you so much. A pleasure to be here. First of all, we'd like to thank Fores and ELF for the opportunity to write this report. It's been really a great pleasure to do this, gather some of these important messages in a policy report. Also, very much thank you for the hosts today for inviting us to present the report here in Helsinki. I actually personally take any opportunity I have to come to Helsinki. I love this city, and also, it doesn't matter if it's November or June. I always like it so much. Over to the report. Can I have this done, please? We're going to talk about carbon dioxide removal today, and specifically two technologies. And I cannot take for granted that everyone knows everything about carbon dioxide removal. So we will do have a few introductory words about why we need carbon dioxide removal. So this is an image that is based on a number of IPCC scenarios, and it kind of shows why there is an absolute need for carbon dioxide removal to attain any temperature targets. We need to drastically reduce emissions. We all know this, and it's a desperate situation where emissions globally actually continue to increase still, but they need to get down to significantly lower levels, say 10% of where they are today. But at the end, there will be some emissions that are extremely challenging to mitigate. For example, some emissions in the agricultural sector, and some emissions connected to aviation, for example. So there will be a level of emissions, but we need to get down to net zero if the level of greenhouse gases is not going to continue rising. So those residual emissions, they need to be counterbalanced by negative emissions or carbon dioxide removal so that we can get to net zero. So that's the one crucial reason that we need carbon dioxide removal. The second one is that we are acting too late. We have set a 1.5 degree target, and we're talking about sometimes a 2 degree target. But mitigation globally is not really happening at the pace that it needs to be happening. So we are going to overspend the carbon budget. There will be too high levels of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere for that target. So the level of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere has to be brought down. And how can that be done? That can be done by actually attaining levels of carbon dioxide removals that are larger than the residual emissions, so that globally we have net negative emissions. And we need to do this for a period of time that is long enough to get down to the ppm level, or the concentration of greenhouse gases that is necessary. So those are the two main reasons that we cannot attain the temperature targets that we're talking about without carbon dioxide removal. Now, we're not talking, there are many different methods for carbon removal, but we're going to talk about BECCS and DACCS, so bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, and direct air capture and storage. This image gives a kind of better understanding, I think, of the differences between carbon, just CCS, carbon capture and storage, and the CDR methods that we are talking about. So the first, the image marked A shows, this is a fossil fuel system taking carbon from the underground and emitting it into the atmosphere. That's what we've been doing for centuries. And then with CCS, it's possible to separate carbon dioxide from a flue gas stream, compress it, transport it to a location where it can be injected into the underground and stored in geological formations. This will not get rid of all emissions. It's not feasible really to capture 100% of the carbon dioxide in a flue gas stream, but up to 90% and perhaps a little bit more. It's really a matter of cost, how high you can go. And so with CCS and fossil fuels, you can get much closer to zero emissions, but not all the way down to zero emissions. So actually CCS, with fossil fuels, that will be one of the sources of residual emissions that need to be counterbalanced in the future, as long as we keep using fossil fuels. I'm not going to talk about C, that's CCU, using carbon dioxide for various purposes once it has been captured and not just storing it. So then we get down to the second row, where we have bioenergy, first of all. With bioenergy, it's generally regarded that if you have balance in the land use system, where the harvesting of biomass is in balance with the regrowth of biomass, then you can, on the longer term, you can regard bioenergy as carbon neutral or nearly carbon neutral. So, but then if you attach carbon capture and storage to a bioenergy system, then we move down to a negative emission system, or carbon dioxide removal, where the CO2 is first absorbed by growing trees or biomass, separated in an energy conversion plant, and then injected underground and stored. So then we have a kind of a carbon dioxide pump, taking carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and storing it durably away from the atmosphere. You can do the same thing without biomass by simply absorbing CO2 out of the air using different absorbents, and having basically building large fans that pull air through an absorption reactor, and then also transporting it and storing it underground. So that's what the abbreviation DACCS stands for. Now, how much CDR do we need? In the latest IPCC report, we have, in the scenarios that meet the 1.5 degree target, we have between 30 and 780 gigatons of CO2 removed through BECCS between now and 2100. So this is, and the annual emissions now are about 50 gigatons globally. So you can see that these are very large numbers. And for DACCS, we have between 0 and 310 gigatons. And for CDR in the land use sector, so by increasing the biomass stock, between 20 and 400 gigatons CO2. These numbers cannot be added on top of each other. They're from different scenarios. So in a scenario with a lot of BECCS, there is maybe less DACCS, and with some scenarios with a lot of DACCS, there's less BECCS. But then, so this is the challenge now, because of what happened to the slide, but I know the numbers. Today, in the world, if you look at additional carbon dioxide removal through land, the management of land-based systems, so accumulating carbon in ecosystems, that represents about 2 gigatons per year. So this is really a very small quantity compared to what is needed. And then if you go to the more technical methods like BECCS and DACCS, we're looking at 2 million tons per year. And this is nothing compared to what is needed. And DACCS is only a few thousand tons per year in the world. So there is a need for a tremendous scaling of these technologies to actually to do what is absolutely necessary to attain the 1.5 degree target. And that's a great challenge. Oh, everything is messed up again. So we have some critique against these technologies. I have been talking about what they are good for, but they also have some downsides. One critique about carbon dioxide removal is that the mere thought that later on in the century we can remove CO2 that we have emitted might make us feel a bit relaxed about what we need to do today. So it can deter the necessary mitigation efforts today. And obviously, this needs to be ensured that it doesn't happen through policy. How do you do that through policy? I believe, and a lot of other experts believe, that we need separate targets. We need targets for emission reductions, timetables and targets for emission reductions that are extremely ambitious. And then in parallel, we need targets and timetables for carbon dioxide removal, so that we ensure that we race full speed ahead on both tracks in parallel. We have some problems that relate to socioeconomic impacts. For example, to do the quantity of carbon removal through BECCS that is necessary, we need massive amounts of land to produce all the biomass that we need. And there will be competition for land, for food production, other purposes, raw materials, and generating biomass for BECCS. This is a huge challenge. Another challenge is with DACCS. DACCS requires tremendous amounts of energy because the concentration of CO2 in air is very low, and it takes a lot of energy to extract that CO2 out of the air. So where can this be done? Large parts of the world have energy shortage already. There's electricity poverty. Making DACCS there is going to be a challenge unless we expand renewable electricity production incredibly and can get down to very low costs. And then another problem is cost. BECCS is very expensive. DACCS currently is extremely expensive. We're talking about BECCS at least $200 per ton. So this is 10 times many other conventional mitigation methods, the cost of those. And DACCS currently costs perhaps $1,000 per ton. But this is a very early, immature technology, and costs will be reduced. The question is, how much? We're uniquely positioned in the Nordic region to show the world how carbon dioxide removal can be done. We have in Finland and in Sweden and some extent Denmark unusually large quantities or large numbers of large point emissions of biogenic CO2 in pulp mills, in district heating plants or combined heat and power plants. We have initiated in Norway since the late 90s geological storage of CO2. And the Norwegians are supporting the two first CCS facilities, one in a cement plant, one in a waste-to-energy plant, where there will be some biogenic materials, so that's half and half BECCS and fossil fuel. Denmark is supporting through procurement auctions or procurements CCS, and they're preparing to store CCS offshore and onshore. So they're now currently doing the third round of procurements for CCS, and they awarded the first contract to a large biomass-based plant in Denmark run by Ørsted. So they will be doing BECCS in Denmark. Sweden is now currently having an auction, a reverse auction for BECCS, which is closing on November 22nd. And then the winning bidders will be selected, and they will be awarded state funding towards BECCS. Iceland is developing a new technology for CO2 storage underground, or really mineralization of CO2 in basalt layers, where the CO2 reacts with minerals or turns into minerals. So all together, and we also have the Helsinki Declaration, the Declaration on Nordic Climate Neutrality, which actually emphasizes the role. We want to be world leaders in attaining net zero climate neutrality. It emphasizes the role of CCS, and it emphasizes the role of BECCS, and it emphasizes the role of cooperation. So, I mean, no other region in the world has the opportunity that we have to show how this can be done. And then after it is done here, it needs to be spread throughout the world. Over to Lars.
Thank you, Kenneth. So I'm Lars Zetterberg, and I'm also very pleased to be here, even if it's November. We were here last night and had a delightful evening. So I'm going to follow on what Kenneth has been saying. So next slide, please. And first, a bit about the EU policy. So there was an impact assessment done recently by the EU Commission, which preceded the... which preceded the communication that was done in February this year. I think I can do. Okay. And they estimated the residual emissions, so the remaining emissions in the EU to the year 2040 will be about 800 million tons. And since there are targets, so the EU has a climate target of reaching net zero emissions by by reaching net zero by 2050, there will be a massive need for carbon removals, and they were estimated to be about 400 megatons by the year 2040. And they didn't specify how much should be forestation and how much should be BECCS and DACCS, but approximately 300 of these 400 megatons they have estimated to be from forestation. So about 100 will come from BECCS and DACCS. And also there's been a recent net zero industrial plan adopted by the Council that says that the oil and gas industry needs to provide at least a storage capacity of at least 50 million tons per year starting the year 2030. So that's quite a considerable storage capacity, and it will be needed, of course. And that has also been a framework developed by the EU to safeguard the integrity of CDR. So basically defining what's to be considered as carbon removals and classifying it in different categories, permanent and non-permanent and so on. But what's largely missing is the incentives to create carbon removals. And it's an interesting thing, because when you have emissions, it's very simple to target who should be responsible for doing something about it. But when it's negative emissions, it's a common benefit. It's a benefit for the globe, for the global population. So you can't use the polluter pays principle, but rather there is a benefit, a global benefit. And if you see this as a positive externality, as we say, you could almost talk about the beneficiary pays principle. So basically, that the states should pay for this for carbon removals. But since we don't have a global state, this is probably going to be delegated down on nations instead. So that's one principle that you could use to identify where to put the incentives and who should provide the funding. Another principle is to say, okay, those that are still emitting greenhouse gases, or perhaps those that have historically emitted greenhouse gases, they have an obligation to fund the carbon removals. And that's sometimes called a carbon take-back obligation. So based on these two principles, we've identified 5 funding models, or models to create incentives for carbon removals. And the first one is state guarantees. So, which means that the state, or in other words, the taxpayers, buys outcomes from BECCS and DACCS projects. And that's exactly what's happening now in Sweden and Denmark, and using the storage site in Norway. This can be purchased as long-term contracts between the state and the producers of these removals. And the nice thing about this is that you can create favorable conditions for the first installations that provide learning, and then that can later be ramped up. It also can be used to these negative emissions that are produced can be used towards each nation's climate commitment. So for instance, in Sweden, we've identified that we will need about 10 million tons of negative emissions by the year 2045. And so part of these can be used to fulfill that need. A drawback here is that it's quite expensive. Now, this is an example. The Swedish program is a little less than 3.6 billion euros. And if we say that the price of BECCS is about 150 euros per ton, that will suffice to produce 1.6 million tons of negative emissions per year for 15 years. So it's important, but it's not at all close to the need. So this leads me to the second model, which is to impose a quota obligation on those that emit greenhouse gases. So those that still have emissions, and these are largely the sectors we are looking at, transportation, agriculture, combustion of fossil plastics, and leakage from fossil CCS, they will be imposed with this obligation to purchase credits that represent carbon removals. And you could implement this one-to-one. So for each ton that you are emitting, you have to pay for 1 ton of removal. But at the start, you could have a lower factor, like 0.1, and then ramp it up over time. Of course, this really eases the burden on the states and expands the financing, so you can expand the removals. A drawback of this is that as emissions go down, so will the funding basis for this model. A third model here is to let participants of the EU emissions trading system use credits instead of allowances. And why should they do that? Well, the cap, the total number of allowances in the EU emissions trading system is being reduced every year, and it will reach 0 in the year 2039. So there will clearly be emissions left, and they need to be counterbalanced. So a way to do that is to allow participants to use credits instead, credits representing, for instance, BECCS or DACCS. The good thing about this is that it could create a considerable demand for removals, but a problem is, as Kenneth said, there's a risk that they will use this instead of reducing emissions. And it's important that everyone reduces emissions as much as they can and also funds removals. Skip the last point there. A fourth model is trade between states, and that builds on Article 6 of the Paris Agreement that says that countries can cooperate on a voluntary basis and help each other to reach the climate targets. So, for instance, Sweden can purchase reductions in other countries and use them towards the Swedish targets, or vice versa. But maybe more important is that this can be used to increase ambition, because this trade lowers the total costs to reach a climate target, and that allows for what we call ratcheting, to become more ambitious in our targets. So maybe that's the most interesting part here. The problem here is that under current EU regulations, it's not possible to do this, because these transfers of reductions have to be followed by a so-called corresponding adjustment, so that the same reduction is not used in both countries, and that's not possible today. So that's something that has to be solved in the future. The final model is about the voluntary markets, and I'll let Kenneth elaborate on that, because he's the expert on voluntary markets.
Yeah, so voluntary carbon markets, they work in the way that some organizations, like companies, take on voluntary targets to become, for example, reach net zero emissions. And they can meet these targets by primarily reducing their own emissions within their value chains. But to some extent, more or less, they can also use carbon credits, so purchase mitigation outcomes that occur outside of their value chains to attain their targets. And many of these targets are based on the organization Science-Based Targets that has set a standard for voluntary targets for companies. And it's built into the model that towards the end, there will be a certain level of residual emissions. So companies are expected to reduce their emissions at least 90%, 90 to 95%. But the remaining residual emissions at the end can be counterbalanced through the purchase of carbon credits, but they have to be based on permanent carbon removal. So this represents a global demand for CDR that can be generated for example, in the Nordic countries. Doing this, it's possible to make actually a contribution to raising the global emissions. If the mitigation outcome underlying these carbon credits is not counted towards national targets, but they're counted towards companies' voluntary targets, it actually raises the global emissions beyond the collective level of all countries' global mitigation targets. And as we know, the collective ambition level in the world is insufficient. So that can make an important contribution to actually raising the ambition a little bit more, so that we close the ambition gap that we have in the world. It's obviously a way that is currently actually attracting capital towards or financing towards BECCS. Some Scandinavian companies have already sold carbon credits to international players. And some very deals that received a lot of media attention. We write in this report about the risk of double claiming, where the mitigation outcome actually counts towards a national target and a voluntary corporate target, and that if this is allowed, then this raising of the collective global ambition does not happen. Yep. Was that our last slide?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Super. Great. Thank you for that insightful presentation. You may take your seat again. Thank you so much. And now I'd like to invite the panel to the stage. And two of our panelists are with us in person, and as Ted said in the beginning, two are joining us virtually from Sweden and Iceland. So please welcome Kati Kopponen. I'll stand here. A senior scientist and member of the Finnish climate change panel, who also specializes in carbon capture. That's correct, yeah. And then we have Silja Borgastottir-Sandelin, vice president of the Swedish People's Party of Finland. And on screen we have Johan Börje from Stockholm Exergi, which is an energy company that provides energy to almost all of Stockholm, and is now in the midst of creating Sweden's first and largest carbon capture facility. Can you hear us, Johan?
Yes, I can. I hope you can hear me. Great to be here. Thank you.
Loud and clear. And then we also have Olafur Teitur Gunnarsson, head of policy at Carbfix, an Icelandic company that essentially turns CO2 emissions into stone. Is that correct, Olafur? Yeah. Super.
Very true. Thank you. Happy to be here.
Great. So I hope you've all managed to read the report, but at least you've heard the author's presentation. So briefly, what are your reflections? What stood out to you? Was there anything particularly good, something you felt was missing, anything surprising? Kathy, would you like to start?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for inviting me, and it was very a pleasure to read the report from the colleagues from IVL. It was very clear, and it helped myself to clarify my thoughts as well, I think. So I think it was a very good thing that you raised the question of mitigation deterrence there, because this is a risk that if we talk too much about CDR, carbon dioxide removals, we might forget that at the same time we really need these drastic emission reductions, as you said earlier. So this is very good to highlight this, because even if we emit too much CO2, the climate change impacts start to take place, and we are not actually sure which of them are reversal. So if we overshoot the emissions too high, even if we manage to remove the carbon from the atmosphere later on, we are not sure that all the impacts will be reversal. So there is a big risk of relying too much on CDR. But at the same time, we know that we will need it, so we need to do the two things at the same time. And then maybe just shortly a comment on the one of the incentive pathways you showed was the quota obligation. And this is, I must refer to Professor Miles Allen from Oxford University, who is behind the carbon take-back obligation idea. And he's always referring to an idea that we could also put that obligation to the fossil fuel producers. So not the emitters, but the producers, because they are the ones who are ultimately responsible of these emissions, and they have the money. So that could be a good place to set these obligations. And the EU Net Zero Industry Act is actually the first instrument that starts to do that, because they set the obligation for the fossil fuel producers to start producing the CO2 storage facilities in Europe. So that's an example of how that could be done. Yeah.
Thank you. Silja, what are your thoughts on the paper?
First of all, thank you very much for the paper. It was extremely interesting. I don't work in science. My perspective is purely political. So my thoughts are probably different from someone who works with these cases every day. I have maybe, I share the concerns, but I also have other concerns, which I will come back to. First of all, I have to say that the most important part is to reduce our emissions, and that's where my political concern lies, but I'll get back to you on that. I'll start by saying that the government and also my party, the Swedish People's Party, is committed to meeting the emission reduction targets and moving forward to carbon neutrality first, but of course in the long run also carbon negativity. The government will advance Finland's position as a frontrunner by developing a new energy and climate strategy aimed at the carbon negativity. And the focus is on promoting the clean transition and investing in also that the industry will turn into have the same strategy. This strategy is, there's probably someone at the ministry working on this at the moment, so this is something that we can see in soon to be discussed. Because of the forest industry and use of bioenergy, Finland has a natural competitive advantage when it comes to capture and utilization of wood-based carbon dioxide. However, the carbon sink from the land use sector has dropped significantly. The government is committed to advancing sustainable and tactical solutions to address this gap, but of course, this is one of the big concerns I have. What we heard today is very important, but as a representative from a political party that sees these questions as very important, I also fear that parties that don't see climate change as a big issue see this as a quick fix, that we don't have to take to do big things to actually tackle climate change in the long run. So my biggest fear is politics.
Well, I share that concern actually. Johan, what do you think?
Thank you. I think the report is excellent in describing the situation we're in and the great need we have for permanent CDR. I think we heard that we are already late to the game. We need tremendous scaling. If you sit down and do the calculation, you will realize that only in Europe we need to get a plant online almost every second month of the size of 1 million tons per year. It's almost industrially infeasible. So we really need to focus policy and funds into these industries if we should have a chance to get anywhere close to the figures that the European Commission is talking about. And I think that is very well highlighted. I may be missing a strategy, how we go from where we are right now at this very early phase where the voluntary carbon market is essential over the compliance market where the funding must be carried by the industrial players on the market, and then how we get to net negativity where I think we need the taxpayers' money to continue to be active, whereas we in the early phase should try to minimize the cost of the taxpayer. I like a little bit more nuanced debate about the mitigation deterrence, because that is now becoming such a big question, but it's never analyzed. Considering the cost we have associated with these instruments, it's almost impossible to envisage that we would go down the path where we pay 3 to 5 times more to solve the climate crisis than we otherwise could. So I think we need to put this in a proportion and find the proper safeguards, but it's not such a big problem considering the relationship on the cost. Also, there is a very important industrial perspective. So this is not missing, I guess it's missing in the report, but it's not the job of the report, but maybe for policymakers, this is a great opportunity for the Nordic countries. We just heard that, Sweden and Finland. And we should think more about this as an industry policy question and maybe less like a climate question, because from a climate perspective, this will be great, but we may be missing the industrial wave, and that is being taken by other countries and other continents. Now, I do disagree strongly with some elements in the report, and the authors, they continue to portray that there would be a problem with nations aggregating and claiming for national targets what corporates are accomplishing and claiming in the corporate ledgers. I actually think that is perfectly normal and even a necessity for this industry to succeed. We can come back to that. It's a complicated question, but with the sense of urgency that we have in the report, which is great, in the other hand, it is also actually helping to delay the offtake of this industry, because it continues to create this uncertainty, which we need to manage, and it would be such a sad outcome if this industry is delayed. I'd like to make one final remark. It's very important to note that the Swedish government aid, which then has the deadline by the 21st of November, and we're working around the clock to be successful in that, it is not a purchase by the Swedish state. It's very important to clearly spell out that it's a government aid, just like the government is aiding, for instance, fossil-free steel, such that we can produce these instruments. And then, just like with the fossil-free steel, the government would be counting the outcome. If it was a purchase, we would never sell it to the voluntary market. We cannot sell the same instrument to entities. Thank you.
Thank you, Johan. Olafur, we'd love to hear your perspective as well.
Yeah, thank you very much. If people don't know what we are doing here in Iceland, it's mineralizing CO2 in the ground, where it turns to stone. I have an example here where you can see the white spots in the rock is actually former CO2 that has mineralized and turned into stone. So this novel approach has some advantages in terms of permanence and really minimizing the risk of any leakage. Thank you for the report. I think it highlights both the need for removals and accurately describes some effective ways to finance it. I agree with Johan on all his points. I think the concern about mitigation deterrence, when considered in the perspective of the costs of these solutions today, I think it is very a low risk that we will just all flock towards these solutions while they are still quite expensive, and we mustn't be confused about the need to really develop them and bring the costs down to make them more competitive. One issue that's quite relevant to us at Carbfix and other storage providers is not a need for funding, but also to consider the disincentives, some of the disincentives or hurdles that the current regulatory framework places specifically on storage of CO2, and specifically on storage of CO2 that originates from direct air capture, BECCS, and such sources that are outside the scope of the ETS system. The ETS the system is set up in such a way that it doesn't really care about the CO2 that is captured from the atmosphere. It is not regulating it at all. The system wouldn't mind if these emissions or CO2 would just remain in the atmosphere. But as soon as somebody captures it and puts it in the ground, then the ETS system comes and places a liability on storage operators who are responsible for the geological storage, who then become liable for penalties if there were to be any leakage from the system. So the system doesn't provide any rewards, but it places the liabilities and penalties on this. So this increases naturally the cost of storage, and storage can sometimes be overlooked as a crucial component of the whole value chain of CDR. So this mismatch of rewards and penalties in the ETS system would have to be addressed in our opinion, and not covered in the report. And it's maybe a little bit of a complex issue, but very, very important.
Thank you, Olafur. Kathy and Silja, Johan and Olafur, they mentioned some of the obstacles or challenges facing this industry. What would you, from a Finnish perspective, would you say are the main barriers to scaling up these solutions in Finland? What would you say, Kathy?
Well, in Finland we have a lot of potential for BECCS, so we have 28 megatons of biogenic CO2 emissions emitted each year from pulp and paper industry and combined heat and power production plants. But the main obstacle and the main concern of the Finnish climate change panel at the moment is the state of the land use sector in Finland, as you said. So if we are at the same time losing our forest carbon sink, the BECCS doesn't really, we only do BECCS for counterbalancing that impact, and we don't really create like additional negative emissions. So I think that's a big risk. So we should really address the policies to improve the situation in the land use sector, improve the state of the sink, and then BECCS can, if done with the balanced sink, then BECCS is a really good thing, and we will need it to reaching our 2030 carbon neutrality target. So most likely it will be challenging without any carbon dioxide removals to reach that target. Another challenge in Finland currently, I think, is the money, because, for example, the Swedish reversed auction system has the same budget for 15 years as we had once in Finland. So the current government is proposing to put around 150 million euros per ton to this issue, combined with CCU, CDR and CCU, and you have the same money for 15 years. So that's a challenge in Finland. So we need the money from somewhere else.
Yes, I was going to talk about the money as well. I mean, this government is having big challenges with the national economy and is trying to balance the economy, and that of course has implications on every sector in society. And when you are at a negotiating table, when you have social and healthcare on one side, you have climate issues on one side, you have education, you have all the parts of that society has to take care of. It's, of course, a negotiation on what is most important. And different parties look on that problem from different perspectives. So in Finland, this is hard. This fall, some of you maybe read a news article from the environmental ministry that they started to promote voluntary carbon markets. And that's, of course, not in the same way a cost for the states if you try to get individuals or companies to actually also take this issue as a big issue. But that also means that it doesn't get the same push forwards as if there would be more players on the market, if the state would take a bigger part of this issue. So I mean, it's hard. It's politics. It's always a balance between different issues, and that's the situation we are in right now. And some of us think this is an issue that needs to be taken care of right now because it's more expensive in the long run, and some see other parts as more important.
Thank you. So now that we've discussed the challenges, Olafur and Johan, what reforms or policy changes would you most like to see from policymakers, both nationally and at the EU level? Johan, would you like to start?
Thank you. It's all about, let's say, getting this industry off the ground at the lowest possible cost for the taxpayer. and not missing the train, because now we have this fantastic opportunity for the Nordic countries. And so we need to think through all the steps of claiming, how do we maximize the participation by the private sector in the voluntary carbon market, because we can't rush into compliance immediately. We need an industry in order to bring in the compliance. I am very much in favor personally of the Miles Allen take-back obligation, and thinking about how we may be evolving the Net Zero Industry Act. And so at this phase, promoting the voluntary carbon market, helping it, thinking carefully through how we introduce it into the ETS, getting additional compliance like quota obligation into the picture, setting up this framework would be extremely helpful for the industry and investors. And of course, making sure that the EU carbon removal certification framework is brought to a successful conclusion as fast as we can, because that gives a standard for the industry to harmonize around. And that would also be driving purchases from the voluntary carbon market. Don't be obsessed with efficiency at this early phase. We are actually building a completely new industry. We have to go through learnings, and that's why we need to start building, and we can perfect the system as we go along. The critical piece now is timing and money, and if it's not perfect in terms of any dimension, we can fix that, but we cannot fix that we miss the train.
I agree 100%. We are so late in the game. And it always sticks in my mind what a person associated with Northern Lights project said. It is many, many times easier to get all the permits for extracting oil from the ground than it is for putting the carbon back into the ground. We seem to be looking for perfect things, and in this emergency, where we are so late in the game to put out the fire, sometimes it feels that we are looking for things to not do something. So we obviously can't be perfect from the start. I would say I agree with all of the points from Johan. Also, from a political perspective, we probably need to be talking more about normalizing the idea of cross-border transport of CO2. Carpix is developing a mineralization hub here in Iceland, which would receive CO2 captured from hard-to-abate industries in Europe and possibly even BECCS plants. This idea is quite novel to the public, to be transporting CO2 between countries. So I think it's great that some of the Nordics have actually taken the position that they want to become hubs for those geological storage solutions. And we need to normalize that idea and also make sure that the regulatory environment allows for all of this to happen, because just as the oil industry was very successful in extracting oil from some places on the planet and transporting it somewhere else, it has been very efficient in that endeavor, and that's why we have some of the problems we are facing. We also need to be using the geologies that are most favorable for storage to take care of the problem, and that involves massive transport networks that we mustn't overlook. We are very often discussing about different ways to capture CO2, but we have to store it somewhere. And that is it seems that according to the analysis by the EU that there will be a much more CO2 captured than there is storage available. So we see in the text increasing urgency about developing storage areas and transport networks to get the CO2 there. So that has to be a good focus, and we see some good indications. Further, I would also go back to the point of the ETS system penalizing storage of non-ETS sourced CO2, which is a regulatory reform that we would see as very important. Whether it's realistic to change that will remain to be seen, but it does place a high cost, or let's say liability, on the storage part of the value chain, without any logic there being for it, because the CO2 was captured from outside of the ETS system.
Thank you. Very concrete points. I like that. Kati, what policy recommendations does the Finnish climate change panel have for the government in this area?
Well, we urge for the measures on the land use sector. So those need to take place to increase the sink. We must discuss about the sustainable level of harvest in Finland. And then at the same time, we need to start thinking about BECCS as well, because to scale it up for 2040, we need to start now.
Yeah. We need to start now. That's basically the message.
Yeah.
Oh, yes. Well, thank you. Time is certainly moving fast, and unfortunately, I don't think we have time for a Q&A, but I would like to ask the authors back on stage, if you don't mind. Because now that you both heard the panel, maybe you could briefly just share your key takeaways from the discussion.
Certainly. Yes, thank you. Such an excellent panel and really good inputs from everyone. A few responses or comments. So when it comes to policies, I think we need to think in terms of policy sequencing, so that at a starting point we want to get the first installations in operation, and that means that I think state support will be very important, along with voluntary markets, to get these first learnings. And then after that, I think it will be very interesting to move on either to the quote obligation or to include it in the EU ETS. When it comes a remark on mitigation deterrence, yes, I agree that it's not going to be an issue to start with, because the cost of both BECCS and specifically DACCS is so much higher than the price of emission allowances. But if we look ahead of time towards the year 2040, and I mean we are now discussing a framework to 2040, then the shadow price of carbon, according to the European Commission, is somewhere between 240 and 270 euros, and that's well in line with the price of BECCS. And at the same time, well, during the time the price of emission allowances is going up, the cost of BECCS is going down. So at one point, I think we need to address this issue, but not now. Including in ETS, I think it's possible. Johan Börje was mentioning safeguards. I think that will be important. Personally, I would prefer to have two separate systems. So we let the ETS focus on emission reductions, and then we create a parallel ETS 3, if you want, with negative emissions, and that you have so you have control of what you're doing with mitigation, with emissions reductions, and then you have timetables and targets for negative emissions, for carbon removals, and that you make sure to create financing for that. Maybe it's going to be more costly, but I think it's a way we need controls for both these issues. Yes, and I also agree with Olafur that it's crazy to penalize capture. I mean, then the analogy would be to penalize trees for capturing CO2. That's also crazy. So I'll stop with that.
Yeah, thank you for excellent comments from everyone in the panel. I would just like to address two of the issues that were brought up. Several commented on mitigation deterrence, and Lars already commented on it as well, but I think the discussion about mitigation deterrence should be seen broadly, considering all different CDR methods that are at hand, not only BECCS and DACCS. And then we have a lot of very cost-effective measures that can be done in the land use sector to absorb CO2, and this might actually deter some other emission reduction actions already today. And the second point is that I think we need to be aware of what might be referred to as intertemporal mitigation deterrents, where the mere knowledge that we can remove CO2 in the future gives us yet another reason not to work so hard today. So this is one fear. And then I certainly believe in carbon markets. I think that market mechanisms is a kind of oil or grease in the machinery that can make things work a lot more efficiently. But they build on carbon markets, in particular voluntary carbon markets, build on trust and credibility. So I don't think this is a reporting issue, and I don't think it's a matter of whether the Swedish state is supporting or purchasing the tons of biogenic stored CO2. It's a matter of the claims and the credibility of the claims. We have seen in the past how, the arguments that we need as much money as possible into the market so that we can do a lot has led to failure with respect to integrity. And then this kind of ruins the trust in the market. And the market has really, the voluntary carbon market nearly died for a while. Now it's back again. And I think it's very important to work on a system that has a foolproof credibility. And I would like to see a company that claims net zero emissions and uses carbon credits as part of that has contributed to additional mitigation outcome. They shouldn't be doing this on the basis of having supported a country to attain a target that that country has already promised that it's going to attain by itself. So that's my comment. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And that brings us to the end of this seminar. So first and foremost, I would like to express my big gratitude to you for this very insightful and important report. And also, of course, to our panelists for your insightful comments. And lastly, also I want to thank you who are here today and also the people who are watching this online. And I just want to say that this is the second of 3 policy papers that we are publishing this year in collaboration with ELF. And the upcoming paper will focus on social acceptance for wind power. And it identifies different ways and best practices to boost local support. And I don't think you would want to miss that. So stay tuned. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.